The guitar went sailing through the air at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, spinning end over end before crashing into the kitchen wall with a sound that would haunt me for the next 3 years. "Damn it, Danny!" The words ripped from my throat like shattered glass as I watched my son's acoustic guitar, his most prized possession, the one his father had saved up 3 paychecks to buy, slide down the faded yellow wallpaper and land in a heap next to the trash can. Danny stood frozen, in the doorway, his dark hair hanging in his eyes, still wearing yesterday's clothes. At 19, he had his father's lean frame and stubborn jawline, but right now he looked like a little boy who just watched his dog get hit by a car. "Mom." His voice cracked on the single word. I stared at what I'd done, my chest heaving, my hands still shaking with the rage that had possessed me. The guitar lay there like a broken bird, its body cracked, strings snapped and curling. In the sudden silence, I could hear Mrs. Peterson's TV through the thin walls, some morning show host laughing about something that probably wasn't funny. This wasn't how this morning was supposed to go. This wasn't how any of this was supposed to go. It had started 3 hours earlier when I'd gotten home from my overnight shift at County General Hospital. I'd been working as a nurse's aide for 2 years, ever since the diner cut my hours. 12-hour shifts that left my feet screaming and my back aching. But it paid $17 an hour, more than I'd ever made in my life. I'd walked into our cramped rental house on Maple Street, expecting Danny to be asleep in his room, like any normal 19-year-old would be at 4 in the morning. Instead, I found him passed out on the couch, fully dressed, with empty beer bottles scattered around the coffee table and the TV still blaring some late-night music video. The sight had hit me like a punch to the gut. He looked exactly like his father used to after those long nights at Riley's bar, when Marcus would stumble home smelling like cigarettes and broken dreams, mumbling about how this was going to be his big break, how some A&R guy was going to discover him any day now. I'd spent an hour cleaning up the mess, the bottles, the pizza boxes, the sheet music scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. I'd covered Danny with his grandmother's old quilt and tried to pretend my hands weren't shaking as I made coffee in the kitchen where his father used to sit every morning, planning his next gig. But when Danny finally woke up and shuffled into the kitchen, asking what was for breakfast, like nothing had happened, something inside me just snapped. "Where were you last night?" I'd asked, trying to keep my voice level as I poured coffee into 2 mismatched mugs. "The Bluebird Cafe," he'd said, not meeting my eyes. "They had an open mic night." "Until 4 in the morning?" He'd shrugged. "We went to Jake's place after, had a few beers, worked on some songs." "You had more than a few beers, Daniel." That's when he'd looked up, and I saw the flash of defiance in his dark eyes. The same look his father used to get when I questioned his choices. "I'm an adult, Mom. I can have a beer if I want." "Not in my house, you can't. Not when you're supposed to be looking for a real job." "I have a job. I'm a musician." The words had hung in the air between us like a lit fuse. I'd set my coffee mug down carefully, my hands trembling with the effort to stay calm. "Playing for tips at coffee shops isn't a job, Danny. It's a hobby. A very expensive hobby that I can't afford anymore." "It's not a hobby." His voice had risen, cracking like it did when he was 15 and arguing about curfew. "This is what I do. This is who I am. This is what your father said too." The moment those words left my mouth, I knew I'd crossed a line. Danny's face had gone white, then red, his jaw clenching the way it did when he was trying not to cry. But I couldn't stop myself. 3 years of watching him chase the same impossible dream that had consumed his father. 3 years of working, double shifts to keep us afloat while he played pretend musician. 3 years of fear and frustration came pouring out like poison. Your father thought he was going to be the next Johnny Cash, too. I'd continued, my voice getting sharper with each word. He spent every night in dive bars, playing for drunks who didn't care, while I worked 2 jobs to keep the lights on. And where did it get him? Where did it get us? Dad died in a car accident, Mom. He didn't die chasing music, but he might as well have. The words exploded out of me. He was driving home from some godforsaken gig at 2 in the morning when that drunk driver hit him. If he'd had a real job, a 9-to-5 job like normal people, he would have been home in bed where he belonged. Danny had stared at me for a long moment, his eyes filling with tears he was too proud to let fall. Is that really what you think? He'd whispered. That Dad died because he loved music? I should have stopped then. Should have taken it back, pulled him into my arms, told him I was just scared and tired and saying things I didn't mean. But the fear was too big, too raw. The fear that I was going to lose him the same way I'd lost his father, to a dream that would never love him back. I think he died because he was selfish, I'd said, my voice cold as winter. Because he cared more about his music than he did about his family. And I think you're just like him. That's when Danny had grabbed his guitar from where it leaned against the kitchen counter. That's when he'd looked at me with tears streaming down his face and said, "Fine, if that's what you think of me, then maybe I should just leave." And that's when I'd lost my mind completely. I'd lunged forward and grabbed the guitar from his hands. And for a moment, we'd struggled over it, like children fighting over a toy. The instrument that represented everything I feared, everything I hated about the path he was choosing. "You want to throw your life away?" I'd screamed. "You want to end up like your father? Then get out. Get out of my house." And I'd thrown his father's guitar across the room like it was trash, like it meant nothing, like it hadn't been the most precious thing in our house for the past 4 years. Now, standing in the wreckage of what I'd done, I watched my son kneel beside his broken guitar. He picked up the largest piece, the body with its splintered face and dangling strings, and cradled it like a wounded animal. "Danny, don't." His voice was quiet, deadly quiet. "Just don't." He stood up slowly, still holding the broken instrument, and looked at me with eyes that belonged to a stranger. Not my little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. Not the teenager who'd played me songs he'd written for my birthday. This was someone I didn't recognize, someone hard and cold and finished with me. "You know what, Mom? You're right. I am just like Dad. And maybe that's not the worst thing in the world." He walked past me toward the hallway, his bare feet silent on the worn linoleum. I heard him moving around his room, drawers opening and closing, the sound of his old duffel bag being dragged from the closet. I stood frozen in the kitchen, staring at the pieces of broken guitar scattered across the floor. The neck had snapped, clean in two, and I could see the intricate inlay work Marcus had paid extra for. Tiny mother-of-pearl birds flying up the fretboard. Danny used to trace those birds with his finger when he played, unconsciously following their flight path. Mrs. Peterson's morning show droned on through the wall, a cheerful voice reading the weather forecast. Sunny and mild, perfect for outdoor activities. A normal Tuesday in October for everyone except us. 20 minutes later, Danny was back in the kitchen with his duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a black case in his hand. His electric guitar, the cheap one he'd bought himself with money from his part-time job at the coffee shop. "I'm leaving," he said simply. I turned to face him, taking in details like I was trying to memorize them. He'd changed into clean jeans and a black t-shirt. His hair was combed back, revealing the scar on his forehead from when he'd fallen off. His bike at 7. He looked older somehow, like the fight had aged him 5 years in 20 minutes. Where will you go? The question came out smaller than I'd intended. Nashville. Jake's cousin lives there, says. I can crash on his couch for a while? Nashville. Of course. The promised land for every wannabe country singer with a guitar and a dream. The place where Marcus had always said he'd go someday. After he saved up enough money. After he got his big break. After. With what money? I asked, hating myself for how cold I sounded. He pulled a crumpled envelope from his back pocket, the kind the bank gave you when you closed an account. I've been saving. Tips from the coffee shop, birthday money from Grandma, the $20 you give me every week for groceries that I've been stretching into 40. The words hit me like a slap. He'd been planning this. While I thought he was just dreaming, just playing around, he'd been saving money and making plans. My 19-year-old son had been more responsible about his future than I'd given him credit for. How much? I whispered. Enough for a bus ticket and first month's rent on a room somewhere. Maybe 2 months if I'm careful. 2 months. In Nashville, where rent was expensive and competition was fierce, and dreams went to die. I thought about all the stories I'd heard over the years. Young musicians who'd gone to Music City with nothing but hope and ended up homeless, or worse. The statistics ran through my head like a grim slideshow. Only 1% of aspiring musicians ever made a living at it. The suicide rate among artists was twice the national average. The addiction rate was even higher. Danny, please. My voice cracked. Just wait. Think about this. You're throwing away everything for a fantasy. He adjusted the guitar case strap on his shoulder, and I noticed his hands were steady now. Steadier than mine. No, Mom. I'm finally doing something real. This isn't a fantasy to me. It never was. But what if you fail? What if you run out of money and end up on the streets? What if I don't fail? He looked me straight in the eye, and for a moment I saw Marcus so clearly it took my breath away. Not the broken down man who died at 34, but the young musician I'd fallen in love with at 22. The one who'd played guitar on our first date and made me believe that love could conquer anything. What if I actually make it, Mom? What if everything I've been working for, everything I've been dreaming about, actually happens? Wouldn't you rather know you supported me than know you tried to stop me? I wanted to tell him that support and realism weren't mutually exclusive. I wanted to explain that I'd watched his father chase the same dream for 12 years. Watched it consume him bit by bit until there was nothing left but disappointment and debt. I wanted to make him understand that I wasn't trying to hurt him. I was trying to save him. But looking at his face, at the determination that radiated from every line of his body, I realized he wouldn't understand. Not now. Maybe not ever. To him, I was just the bitter woman who'd thrown his guitar against the wall, the mother who'd chosen fear over faith. I love you, Danny, I said finally. That's why I can't watch you do this. Something flickered across his face. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment. That's not love, Mom. That's fear. And I won't live my life afraid. He walked toward the front door, and I followed on unsteady legs. The morning sun was streaming through the screen door, making everything look golden and hopeful. Normal people were starting their normal days, going to work, taking kids to school, living sensible lives that made sense. If you walk out that door, I said, don't expect me to be here when you come crawling back. He paused with his hand on the doorknob. I won't be crawling back, Mom. When I come back, it'll be because I made it, because I proved you wrong. And if you don't make it..." He turned the knob and pushed the door open. The sound of the neighborhood waking up drifted in. Dogs barking, car doors slamming, the distant hum of traffic on the main road. Then at least I'll know I tried. I watched through the screen as he walked down our front steps and headed up Maple Street, his guitar case bumping against his leg with each step. He didn't look back, not once. Mrs. Patterson was watering her flower garden next door, and she waved at Danny as he passed. I saw them exchange a few words, saw her face fall. When she realized he was leaving, she looked toward our house then, her expression questioning. But I stepped back from the door before she could catch my eye. I stood in my empty living room, listening to the sound of Danny's footsteps fade away, and tried to convince myself I'd done the right thing. That tough love was still love. That protecting him from inevitable disappointment was worth this temporary pain. The broken guitar pieces were still scattered across the kitchen floor when I finally went back in there. An hour later, I knelt down and started picking them up, trying to fit the larger fragments back together like a puzzle. But guitars aren't like hearts. Once they're broken, you can't just will them whole again. I found one of the mother-of-pearl birds that had broken off the fretboard. It was tiny, perfect, with delicate wings spread wide like it was soaring. I held it in my palm and remembered the day Marcus brought the guitar home. How Danny's eyes had lit up when he saw it. "It's got birds on it, Mama," 8-year-old Danny had exclaimed, running his small fingers over the inlay. "They're flying." "Just like your daddy's songs," I'd said then, caught up in their shared excitement. "They're going to fly all over the world someday." I'd believed it once, before the bills piled up and the gigs dried up and reality set in like a slow-acting poison. Before I learned that dreams were luxuries we couldn't afford. The trash bag was heavy when I finished cleaning. Up 43 pieces of broken guitar, including the tiny flying bird that I almost kept, but finally threw away with the rest. Some things were too painful to hold on to. That afternoon, I called in sick to work and spent 4 hours deep cleaning. Danny's room. I told myself I was just getting it ready in case we needed to rent it out for extra income, but really I was looking for signs, evidence that he'd been planning this longer than I thought, clues about where exactly he was going, anything that might help me understand how we'd gotten to this point. What I found instead was a notebook hidden under his mattress, filled with song lyrics written in his careful handwriting. Page after page of words that cut right through me. She says she loves me, but her love feels like a cage, built from all her fears and all her rage. She can't see the music, only sees the pain. So she'd rather break my heart than watch me break my chains. Another page? I've got my daddy's hands and my daddy's dreams. But Mama says that ain't as good as it seems. She remembers all his failures, not his songs. So she's convinced that dreaming's wrong. And on the last page, dated just 2 weeks ago, sometimes love looks like letting go. Sometimes it looks like standing still. But love ain't throwing stones at hope, and love ain't breaking someone's will. I sat on his bed with that notebook in my lap and cried for the first time since he'd walked out the door. Cried for the songs I'd never hear, for the dreams I'd tried to kill, for the daughter-in-law and grandchildren I might never have because I'd been too afraid to let my son fly. But mostly I cried because I recognized the truth in his words. I'd thought I was protecting him, but I'd really been protecting myself from the fear of losing him like I'd lost his father, from the terror of watching him struggle and fail and get his heart broken by an industry that chewed up dreamers and spit them out. I'd been so busy trying to save him from his father's fate that I'd become his father's nightmare, the person who gave up on the music before it had a chance. The days that followed blurred together like a fever dream. I went to work, came home, heated up frozen dinners for one, and tried to pretend the silence wasn't deafening. I caught myself setting 2 plates on the table, buying his favorite cereal at the grocery store, leaving the porch light on in case he came home late. Friends from work asked about Danny with that careful tone people use when they suspect something's wrong but don't want to pry. I told them he was visiting relatives, trying out college in another state, anything that sounded normal and temporary. I couldn't bring myself to say the words out loud. My son left home, and I don't know if he's ever coming back. 2 weeks after he left, I got a postcard in the mail. The front showed the famous Nashville skyline at sunset, all golden light and promise. On the back, in Danny's messy handwriting, "Made it safe, found a place to stay. Don't worry about me, love D. Don't worry about me." As if I'd done anything else since he walked out that door. I carried that postcard in my purse for months, taking it out during break times at work to read those 5 sentences over and over. Made it safe. That was something, at least. He wasn't sleeping on the streets or worse. He'd found somewhere to land. But as winter turned to spring and spring turned to summer, no more postcards came. The silence stretched between us like a canyon, growing wider every day. I told myself that no news was good news, that if something terrible had happened, someone would have called me. But late at night, when the house creaked and settled around me, I imagined all kinds of awful scenarios. Maybe he was too proud to come home when the money ran out. Maybe he was living on the streets but too ashamed to tell me. Maybe he'd fallen in with the wrong crowd, gotten involved with drugs or crime. Maybe he was lying in some hospital somewhere, hurt and alone, with no emergency contact information because he'd been too angry to include me. I started checking the Nashville newspaper online every morning, scanning the police reports and obituaries, with my heart in my throat. I Googled Missing Persons Nashville, more times than I want to admit. I even called Jake's mother once, pretending I just wanted to chat, trying to fish for information about whether she'd heard from her son about Danny. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice full of sympathy I didn't deserve. "Jake moved to Portland 6 months ago. Didn't Danny tell you?" No, Danny hadn't told me because we weren't speaking, because I'd made it clear that his choices weren't welcome in my house, so he'd stopped sharing them with me entirely. Work became my refuge. At the hospital, I could focus on other people's problems, other people's pain. I could be competent and useful, and needed. I picked up extra shifts whenever they were available, partly for the money, but mostly for the distraction. Anything to avoid going home to that empty house full of memories and regrets. My supervisor, Janet, started giving me concerned looks around the 6-month mark. "Sarah, you've been working doubles every week for 2 months, she said, catching me as I was about to clock in for another overnight shift. "When's the last time you took a day off?" "I'm fine," I said automatically. "I need the hours." "What you need is some balance. When's the last time you saw your son?" "Danny, right? The one who plays guitar?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "He's busy, living his own life." Janet studied my face with the sharp eyes of someone who'd been a nurse for 30 years. "Sarah, I know we don't talk much outside of work, but I've got 3 kids of my own. 2 of them put me through hell before they figured themselves out. Want some advice?" I wanted to say no. Wanted to tell her it wasn't her business, but something in her tone stopped me. "Pride's a luxury parents can't afford," she said gently. "Whatever happened between you two, Don't let it fester. Life's too short and kids grow up too fast. That night, I drafted 17 different text messages to Danny's phone number. Everything from angry demands to know where he was, to tearful apologies for everything I'd said and done. But every time I got close to hitting send, I heard my own words echoing back at me. Don't expect me to be here when you come crawling back. How could I reach out now without looking like I was the one crawling back? How could I admit I'd been wrong without admitting I'd been completely, catastrophically wrong? So I deleted the messages and went back to work and tried to pretend that the hole in my life was something I could live with. Fall came again, marking a full year since Danny had left. The leaves on Maple Street turned the same brilliant oranges, and reds they did every October, and I found myself thinking about all the autumns we'd spent together, raking leaves in the backyard while he practiced guitar on the porch, carving pumpkins at the kitchen table while he hummed songs he was working on, watching him perform in the high school talent show. So proud I cried right there in the auditorium. I was walking home from work one evening, tired to my bones after another 12-hour shift, when I saw Mrs. Patterson in her front yard pulling weeds from her flower bed. "Sarah!" she called out, straightening up with a wince. "How are you holding up, honey?" "I'm fine," I said, the automatic response I'd perfected over the past year. She walked over to the fence that separated our yards, her expression skeptical. "You don't look fine. You look like you haven't slept in months." "I've been working a lot of nights. And how's Danny? Still making music in Nashville?" The question shouldn't have surprised me. Mrs. Patterson had always kept track of the neighborhood kids like they were her own grandchildren. But hearing his name spoken out loud by someone else made my chest tighten. I don't know, I admitted. "We don't talk much anymore." Her face softened with understanding. "Oh, honey, what happened?" Maybe it was the exhaustion, or the loneliness, or just the simple kindness in her voice. But suddenly I was telling her everything. The fight, the broken guitar, the terrible things I'd said. How he'd left and I'd been too proud to stop him, too stubborn to apologize, too scared to find out if he was okay. Mrs. Patterson listened without judgment, nodding in all the right places, making soft sounds of sympathy that reminded me of my own mother. "You know," she said when I finished, "I lost touch with my youngest for 3 years back in the 80s. He wanted to be an artist. Paintings, not music, but same principle. I thought it was foolish, impractical. We had some terrible fights about it." I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. "What happened?" "Pride, mostly. Both of us were too stubborn to bend. Then one day I got a call from a hospital in San Francisco. He'd been in an accident. Nothing too serious, thank God, but enough to scare me. I drove 18 hours straight to get to him." "Was he okay?" "Physically, yes. But emotionally, we'd wasted 3 years, Sarah. 3 years we could have been part of each other's lives. And for what? Because I couldn't admit I was more afraid than he was?" She reached across the fence and squeezed my hand. "Don't make my mistake, honey. Don't let pride cost you your son." That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my phone in my hands, staring at Danny's contact information. His picture was still the one from his high school graduation. Cap and gown, that crooked smile that always made my heart skip. 18 years old and full of dreams I hadn't tried to crush yet. I started typing, "Danny, I'm sorry. I was wrong about everything. Please call me." But then I thought about all the months of silence, all the nights I'd wondered if he was safe, all the birthdays and holidays that had passed without a word. What if he didn't want to hear from me? What if he'd moved on, built a new life that didn't include the mother who'd thrown his dreams against the wall? I deleted the message and put the phone away. 3 more months passed. Winter settled over Ohio like a heavy blanket, and I found myself dreading the holidays. Thanksgiving alone, Christmas alone, New Year's Eve with nothing to celebrate. I decorated anyway, out of habit more than hope, hanging stockings for one, and buying a tree that was too big for just me. I was stringing lights on the tree when the doorbell rang. My heart jumped the way it did every time, hoping against hope that it might be Danny coming home. But when I opened the door, it was a delivery driver holding a package. Sarah Morrison. Yes. Package for you. Needs a signature. I signed for it with shaking hands, not recognizing the return address. Nashville, Tennessee. But not Danny's name. Some company I'd never heard of. Inside was a CD in a plain black case. No label or artwork. Just a handwritten note tucked inside. Thought you should hear this. Jake. Danny's friend who'd moved to Portland. How had he gotten my address? I stared at that blank CD for 3 days before I worked up the courage to play it. I didn't own a CD player anymore. Everything was digital now. But I remembered that Mrs. Patterson had an old stereo system. I could ask to borrow it. Make up some excuse about wanting to listen to old music. But first, I had to know what was on that disc. I drove to the electronics store downtown and bought the cheapest CD player they had, my hands shaking as I handed over the cash. At home, I sat on my couch with the player in my lap, the mysterious CD hovering over the tray. Whatever was on there, it was going to hurt. I could feel it in my bones, the way you can feel a storm coming. But I had to know. After 18 months of silence, I had to know something. I pressed play.